Good day. Today is Tuesday, 16th December 2025, and let me remind you again, if once you've watched today's programme, you decide that you've liked what you've watched and heard, then please do remember to tick the like button. Now, let me proceed with this programme by saying that over the last 24 hours, the Russians have made their first comments, their first very uncompromising comments in response to all of the talk and discussions and proposals and ideas that have been coming out via the media about the discussions which took place between Zelensky and Witkoff and the Americans and the Europeans over the last couple of days in Berlin. And the Russian comments have been absolutely uncompromising. And, well, the Russians have again made clear that they have not changed their positions and that they don't intend to change their positions. The mildest comment so far has been made by Peskov, who is Putin's spokesman. He said that the Russians are aware of the media commentaries that have appeared about security guarantees being provided by the United States to Ukraine, which will be at Article 5 NATO level, even if Ukraine itself will not be part of NATO. He said rather icily that we have not seen any texts yet. When we see them, we will analyse them, which is in effect a way of saying that the Russians are not impressed or pleased by anything that they're hearing. A much tougher set of comments was published over the course of yesterday by ABC News following an interview which it carried out with the hard man of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. Now, I am assuming that this interview was conducted over several days, so it's unlikely that it was given exactly as a response to what has been coming out of Berlin. But anyway, it makes clear, very clear, starkly clear, what the Russians are going to say about what was discussed in Berlin when they're finally provided with the documents. Anyway, Ryabkov made a number of points. He said that the Russians appreciate Donald Trump's efforts to find a negotiated solution of the Ukrainian conflict. We want to finish this on the premise that is sufficient to sides that are involved. At the same time, he also went to say that the Russians do not understand the outcome of the negotiations in Berlin, and we have no idea what transpired there. In other words, they don't understand it because, as far as they're concerned, it seems entirely inconsistent with what they've been hearing from the American side up to now. It is not consistent with the 28 points that Witkoff and Kushner brought with them to Moscow, and it doesn't conform, apparently, to the understanding that the Russians believe Putin and Trump reached with each other during the summit meeting in Anchorage in August. And Ryabkov said that the Russians stand by Anchorage. Russia stands firm on the understandings reached during the meeting between President Putin and President Trump in Anchorage. I think it is a sober and, if you wish, a cool environment where people listen to one another, stick their heads together in order to try to find a way forward. And this is how Ryabkov basically characterized the discussions between the Americans and the Russians, but he clearly does not extend the same to the discussions between the Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans. to repeat again, he said that we have no idea what transpired there. He cannot understand what the Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans could possibly have been discussing. And he made it absolutely clear that the Russians don't just demand a Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass, they want a withdrawal from the entirety of the 5 regions. He specifically said there are 5. We are not able in any form to compromise on this because it would be, in our view, a revision of a very fundamental element of our statehood. So there's been a lot of discussion about the Americans wanting the Ukrainians to withdraw from Donbass. Zelensky, over the course of the last 24 hours, has again effectively, in my opinion, categorically ruled that out. We're told that this was the major sticking point between Zelensky and Witkoff in Berlin. But the Russians are demanding and expecting very much more. They are demanding that the Ukrainians withdraw also from Zaporia and Kherson regions as well. Now, there's been much discussion, much commentary about Putin having made an offer to Witkoff back in August when Witkoff came to Moscow, that the Russians would agree to a ceasefire in Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, provided the Ukrainians withdrew from Donbass. I was skeptical when I first heard those reports, given that the Russians were simultaneously saying that they did not agree to a ceasefire and wanted a final settlement of the conflict. And at the summit meeting in Anchorage, they appeared to have got Trump's agreement to this. I could not see how a ceasefire in Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, supposedly proposed by the Russians, was consistent with Trump's agreement with the Russian position that there needed to be a full and final and complete settlement of the conflict before any cessation of hostilities took place. But then there were continued comments from the Russians themselves about some kind of understanding that supposedly had been reached between Putin and Trump in Anchorage. I said, and have always said, that I thought this was much more likely to be an American proposal, that the Ukrainians withdraw from Donbass and that the Russians stop in Zaporizhia and Kherson region. The Russians have sort of confirmed that. They have never up to now said that they have agreed to it. Recent comments by Putin and Lavrov suggested that, in fact, they did not agree to it in Anchorage. And now Ryabkov is saying quite clearly, quite categorically, that the Russians have not agreed to it. He said it openly in an interview to an American media site, ABC News, that the Russians want a total withdrawal of all Ukrainian troops from Donbass, from Donetsk and Lugansk. There aren't, by the way, many Ukrainians left in Lugansk. I'm not sure whether the Ukrainians still control any territory in Lugansk, just saying. But they don't just want the Ukrainians to withdraw from Donbass, they want them to withdraw from Zaporizhia and Kherson as well. And in fact, my understanding, my take of the Ryabkov's interview with ABC News is that the Russians are not prepared to make any concessions on the topic of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea as well. My sense is that they still insist on international recognition, or at the very least American and perhaps Ukrainian recognition, that these territories are now Russian. And Ryabkov made some very interesting comments over the course of the interview. He said that the special military operation was to protect Russians who were being persecuted in Ukraine. This is what the Russians have always said. It is what Putin claimed at the time when he ordered the special military operation. It has been the Russian position consistently and continuously. And of course, it is set out as one of the objectives of the special military operation. But then Ryabkov went further, and he said that the place of many of these Russians in Ukraine, is in Russia, which, as far as I could see, well, if you take that literally, it seems to me that what Ryabkov is saying, almost, is that any majority Russian-speaking region of Ukraine, any historic Russian-speaking region of Ukraine, belongs to Russia. And, well, that might even extend to Odessa and Nikolaev as well, though he was careful not to say that, of course, in this interview. So, anyway, that was amongst some of the things that Ryabkov said. He said more as well. He said that the Russians will not agree to the deployment of Western troops in Ukraine in any form, including, but not exclusive to, the NATO framework. We are open-minded in terms of what decisions might be made. We definitely will not at any time subscribe to, agree to, or ever be content with any presence of NATO troops on Ukrainian territory. Now, I say all of this because there are reports in the British media, especially, that officials, US officials, some US official, has apparently been telling the Europeans that these Article 5 guarantees that the Americans are now proposing the Ukrainians should be given in place of NATO membership, and the deployment of Western peacekeepers to Ukraine, are things which President Trump believes he can get President Putin of Russia to agree to. Now, it's possible that this is indeed something that President Trump has indeed been saying. He says many things like that at various times. He said, for example, he seemed to suggest back in the spring of this year that he would be able to get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire on the existing conflict lines, an unconditional ceasefire on the existing conflict lines. In fact, he gave on many occasions the impression that a peace deal or a ceasefire deal was almost done. According to the Russians, he told Putin in Anchorage that the Russian demand that the Ukrainians withdraw from Donbass, I'm not sure whether this extends to Zaporia and Kherson regions, and the Russian demand that Ukraine would never join NATO, that apparently, according to the Russians, Trump told Putin in Anchorage that he was sure that he would be able to get Zelensky to agree to that also. Well, as we have seen, President Trump was never able to get President Putin to agree to an unconditional ceasefire on the existing conflict line, and he has never been able to get Zelensky to agree to withdraw Ukrainian troops from Donbass, and even on the NATO membership issue, Zelensky has taken a very tough line, and though he has, to some appearance, agreed to that, he's not prepared to change the Ukrainian constitution. He's not prepared to have Ukraine adopt neutral status, and he's willing to accept, as a matter of reality, a temporary stop to Ukraine's move towards NATO, but in return he expects to get, and has apparently been told that he will get, Article 5 guarantees from the United States. So Trump failed to persuade President Putin in the past, despite telling everybody that he would. He failed to get President Putin in the past to agree to an unconditional ceasefire, and he failed to get Zelensky to agree to the withdrawal from Donbass, and the agreement by Zelensky to drop, for the moment, Ukraine's bid for NATO membership is heavily qualified, and Trump told Putin that he would be able to get Zelensky to agree to those things. And, well, I can say with confidence that he's not going to be able to get Putin to agree to the kind of security guarantees that are now being floated, and to the deployment of NATO or Western peacekeepers or military contingents to Ukraine, no matter what Trump is currently telling the Europeans. Ryabkov's words put that beyond any possible doubt. And Ryabkov has apparently also said in this interview, though I didn't myself hear these specific words of Ryabkov's, but I gather that the entire interview has not yet been published. Anyway, he also apparently said that Russia still insists that Ukraine must revert to its previous neutral status as part of any deal. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, that completely contradicts the idea of the West providing and the United States providing Ukraine with Article 5 guarantees, which amounts in effect to a military alliance between the United States and Ukraine, which is of course incompatible with neutrality. So the Russians are already rejecting everything that is coming out of Berlin, and that was inevitable and certain to happen, but they are already doing this, and they are again pointedly reminding Trump of what the Russians believed he had agreed with them in Anchorage, and they are saying that they are not prepared in any way to shift from that position. Russia stands firm on the understandings reached during the meeting between Putin and Trump in Anchorage. Kiev and its European partners expect a deep and very wrong revision of the US proposal. Russia will not make any concessions about this. So there it is. The Berlin negotiation has taken us further away from peace than we were before it started. Now, the Europeans, of course, are continuing their own way. They've issued a statement. The European countries issued a statement. They, as far as I can tell from this statement, have repeated all the various positions that they always have. They continue to talk about territorial integrity. They continue to use the word ceasefire, which of course the Russians have already rejected, and which Trump said he had dropped after the Anchorage summit meeting, but the Europeans continue to use that word ceasefire. And of course, the Europeans are again talking about deploying Western troops to Ukraine, something which the Russians have said they categorically do not agree to and never will. We definitely will not at any time subscribe to, agree to, or ever be content with any presence of NATO troops on Ukrainian territory in any form. So there you go. Now, the Europeans, by the way, have continued along this path. They have now just concluded some kind of treaty or agreement with the Ukrainians to pursue reparations damages against the Russians. They're going to set up some kind of tribunal or vehicle to this effect, something which, of course, the Russians have never agreed to, but they're prepared apparently to start preemptively legal action of their own against the Russians to try to seize Russian assets. This is what this looks like to me. The Russians, by the way, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency, the SVR, is now claiming that the entire idea of using emergency powers, the EU using emergency powers to freeze indefinitely the Russian assets and ultimately perhaps to seize them or to launch the 140 billion euro loan, that this entire idea originated in London. I'll read what TASS says about this. In its contacts with EU officials, the UK's top leadership is desperately pushing Brussels to take Russian funds frozen in the Belgian depository Euroclear. Britain is urging the European Commission to justify this theft of Russian assets by exploiting legal gaps in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union and by referring to exceptional circumstances. The opinion of European countries that disagree is ignored. And the SVR then goes on to claim the British officials intend to pressure the White House with the threat of Europe's rapprochement with China. London, Paris and Berlin have agreed to send signals to Washington about their readiness to drift towards Beijing if the US continues to push for a deal in Ukraine that does not satisfy the Europeans. And the British are falsely claiming that Russia promised the US to allocate Russian assets frozen by the EU to fund joint projects. Now, as I've said on several programs, the Russians have their own fixation, which is with Britain. They attribute many of the misdeeds that have taken place, or what they judge to be misdeeds, to the British. My own personal view is that Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and people like that need no encouragement from London to engage in these kind of operations. As you will find right across the internet today, the EU has just extended personal sanctions against certain individuals. One of them is somebody I know and whom I greatly respect and admire, and who is a Swiss citizen. I have to be careful, so I'm choosing again my words very carefully here. But I noticed that it is Kaja Kallas who signed off on the resulting document. A person like that, it seems to me, is not going to balk at using emergency powers to do all the various things that she proposes to do. And I don't myself see why she would need encouragement from London. Just saying. But anyway, That's not to say that encouragement from London to do all of these things isn't there. But personally, I think it is a stretch to believe that the Europeans are telling the Americans that if the Americans don't align with the Europeans will align with China against the US. I can't imagine that anything like that is actually happening. But note the point that claims which the SVR says are originating with London, that Russia has promised the United States to allocate frozen Russian assets to fund joint projects, that these claims are false. It looks to me, to be frank, that this is a polite way for the Russians to communicate that these ideas that the Americans have of using the frozen assets for joint Russian-US reconstruction projects in Ukraine, that any idea that the Russians are in agreement with that, or that they're prepared to have their assets used in that sort of way, that is completely untrue also. So we see that this American idea, the Russians are also shooting down. They've never agreed to it. They've never accepted it. It won't happen. At least it won't happen if they have any view, any say in the matter. So anyway, just to continue, the Europeans continue to take the very hard line. And personally, in light of this, in light of what's just happened in Berlin, I think that the whole prospect of negotiations, of diplomacy, is going to be once again stuck. There's no word, by the way, of what the Americans now propose to do, whether Witkoff and Kushner are going to be travelling back to Moscow again. One wonders if they are, what they propose to take with them, if they're going to come with the Berlin ideas, they're going to get a cool reception. Anyway, there's no word so far on what's going to happen. We'll just have to wait and see. But regardless, the key thing is that the Russians have made their total rejection of all of these ideas, all of these proposals, absolutely clear. Now, Eve Smith on Naked Capitalism has written another brilliant article. I do think it is a brilliant article about this whole situation, the negotiations in Berlin. And bear in mind that she was the person who first wrote about the West's propensity to negotiate with itself, which we saw on spectacular display in Berlin, its tendency to negotiate with itself instead of negotiating with the other side. Anyway, she makes the point that if you go to the original 28 points, the 28 points actually contain many provisions which are only workable with European involvement. So, for example, there has to be a comprehensive non-aggression agreement to be concluded between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. There has to be a dialogue between Russia and NATO. There have to be other provisions as well about the lifting of sanctions, the reintegration of Russia in the global economy, the unfreezing of the Russian assets so that it can be used in the way that the United States wants them to be used, and which the Russians have just made clear that they are not in agreement with. So some kind of negotiation between the Americans and the Europeans is unavoidable. That, by the way, is absolutely correct. And to my mind, it illustrates the error of the entire approach. If the Americans were going to negotiate about anything at all with the Russians in Ukraine-related matters, in my opinion, they should have stuck, as basically Eve Smith says, to the original Istanbul formula, the one that had been created in April 2022. That was a bilateral negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. The Americans might have joined in that way, but they should have avoided bringing the Europeans in, and they should certainly have avoided any ideas, floating any ideas, which would have required a European involvement and therefore European participation in the negotiations, and ultimately a European veto in order to make that happen. Had there been an agreement made between the Russians and the Americans, and the Ukrainians perhaps as well, then that would have been the moment for the United States to come along to the Europeans, present them with a fait accompli, with the original agreement that had already been made, and twist the Europeans' arms and get them to agree to all of these other things. Well, I am not here to rework the American strategy. All I will say is that involving the Europeans in these negotiations has had the predictably disastrous effect of neutering whatever merit existed in the 28 points and in the American proposals. Now, Eve Smith does make another absolutely essential point, and that is, what is the point, the purpose of this whole negotiation? And she says that on the American side, on Donald Trump's side, he is desperate to avoid a situation where the war goes on and ends in a Ukrainian defeat, knowing perfectly well that whatever his role in that defeat is, whatever his actual role in that defeat is, he will be blamed for it. Whilst as for the Europeans, they want to set up a situation where a defeat for Ukraine is ultimately blamed on Trump rather than on themselves. And that, of course, means that they do not want a peace agreement, which would amount to a capitulation, and effectively a capitulation and acceptance of Russian terms, because if they were in agreement with that, then they too would own the capitulation. So all of these negotiations are ultimately an exercise in the Americans and the Europeans trying to find ways to shift blame for this debacle between each other. And I think that is the best interpretation of what is going on that I can see so far. So the Americans trying to find some way to persuade the Russians to stop before Ukraine goes down. The Europeans, for their part, determined to keep the war going because they don't want to own the failure, and they don't want to do so by agreeing to terms which would amount to their admission of failure in this conflict that Europe has been locked in against the Russians. So ultimately, it's all about trying to find some way to save face. Well, that's never a good reason to conduct negotiations, and we can see why it is bound to guarantee that the reasons that the agreement, whatever agreement is patched up, will ultimately, from a Russian point of view, always fall short. Now, having said all of these things about Eve Smith's article, there is one point that I am going to push against. Like many people, she assumes that Dmitriev has played an independent role and has worked with Witkoff and Kushner to draft the original 28 points, and that he's acting in effect as an independent agent. My own take of Dmitriev is that he does exactly what Putin tells him, and that he's absolutely carrying out Putin's instructions. I would also say that I think his role in drafting these 28 points has been greatly exaggerated. I think that they're almost entirely the work of Witkoff and Kushner. Anyway, that is my view. It hardly matters because we're no longer talking about the 28 points. What came out of Berlin is completely different. It is in effect the Kellogg plan with some nuances. The Kellogg plan, the freeze, the freeze on the existing conflict lines, which the Russians have already rejected and which they are going to reject all over again. So let's talk now about the real things that actually matter in this war, which is the military situation. Now, the first thing to say is that over the last 24 hours, the Russian Defense Ministry has spoken about the situation in Kupiansk, and it has categorically denied all claims that the Ukrainians have achieved anything in Kupiansk at all. They insist, as we shall see, that the Russians are in complete control of Kupiansk. Now, this series of statements was initiated by an interview given by a Russian Defense Ministry official, Leonid Sharov, who is the spokesman of Battle Group West. That is the military unit, the military force, the Russian military force, Group of Forces West, which claims to have captured Kupiansk and which is fighting in this area. Anyway, Sharov said the following: "I'm staying at a forward command post of the 121st Motorized Rifle Regiment of the 68th Motor Rifle Division of Group of Forces West's 6th Combined Arms Army. Group of Forces West units continue accomplishing combat objectives in the zone of the special military operation. The city of Kupiansk is under the control of the 6th Combined Arms Army." And then Sharov continued that Russian forces are firmly rebuffing all Ukrainian army attacks on communities near Kupiansk, keeping them under their control. Battle group units are firmly repelling enemy attacks on the settlements of Tishenkovka, Moskovka and Sobolevka, retaining control of these communities and engaging the adversary by artillery fire and strike drones at distant approaches, preventing them from breaking through towards Kupiansk. Attack drone teams and artillery crews of the Russian military continue to strike the Ukrainian army's mercenary groups, and the enemy is trying to every day to infiltrate Kupiansk by small groups through an urban cemetery, suffering heavy losses among manpower and equipment. Scattered Ukrainian army groups have been blocked in 2 buildings in the neighborhood of Kupiansk and will soon be destroyed. And we get more detail. This is from TASS. Scattered enemy groups have been blocked in 2 buildings in the neighborhood Yubileyny district. All districts of Kupiansk are under the control of Russian troops. Ukrainian forces will be eliminated shortly by well-coordinated actions of assault teams of the 121st Motorized Rifle Regiment. So that's TASS. The Russian Defense Ministry has then published more words of Sharov. Group of forces West troops exercise reliable control over all districts of Kupiansk. And he says attempts by Ukrainian assault detachments consisting of 2 soldiers to infiltrate from the southwest part of Kupiansk through the cemetery to the outskirts of the Yubileyny district are being suppressed. During these attacks, the enemy suffers losses on a daily basis. Currently, as of the evening of December 15th, 3 small groups consisting of 2 to 6 servicemen of the Ukrainian armed forces are blocked on the outskirts of the Yubileyny district. Their liquidation is underway. So what the Russian Defense Ministry, what the Russian military are telling us is that all of these claims that we've been hearing for the last week or so about a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kupiansk are untrue, that the Ukrainians have recaptured no part of Kupiansk and no part of any of the villages to the west of Kupiansk that they claim to have regained control of, that small groups of infiltrators, 2 in number at any one time, try to infiltrate back into Kupiansk through a cemetery, the town cemetery, that a small group of between 2 and 6 is currently held up in one building, and that they are the only Ukrainian troops in Kupiansk. In all other respects, as the Russian Defense Ministry says, the Russian army has reliable control of all of the districts of Kupiansk. So, that's what the Russians are saying. Now, here it is important to talk about confirmation bias. I have been saying in many programs now, several programs now, that I am deeply skeptical of all of these Ukrainian reports about successful Ukrainian counterattacks in Kupiansk. I've already expressed my view that President Zelensky's appearance at a stela indicating on the outskirts of Kupiansk, about 2 kilometers from Kupiansk itself, Zelensky's words at that stela, claiming that he had actually been inside Kupiansk itself and had congratulated the Ukrainian troops who were in the process of liberating the town, that all of that actually undermined my belief in Ukrainian claims, because I would have assumed that if the situation really were as the Ukrainians claim, and if Zelensky had indeed re-entered Kupiansk, as he also claimed, that we would have had film produced to that effect. Just say, well, that's the view that I have expressed on several programs now, that it seemed to me that this was most likely a media operation rather than a real one, that the Ukrainian gains around Kupiansk were probably fictitious, that it reminded me strongly of Ukrainian claims to have all but recaptured the town of Toretsk earlier this year, would subsequently prove to be untrue, that it reminded me of Ukrainian claims to have recaptured on several occasions the village of Kotlino to the southwest of Pokrovsk, that it reminded me of similar Ukrainian claims to have captured a village called Dobropilia north of Gulyapolye that had just been made a couple of days ago, where there is now clear evidence that the Russians are in firm control. So this has been the view that I've expressed, and now we have the Russians saying all of these things, saying basically that my skepticism is correct and that the Russians do indeed firmly control Kupiansk. Now, it must be said that it is a common mistake to assume the truth of what you already believe to be true. If somebody tells you something that you already believe, then you assume that they are telling you the truth. Because the Russians say that they're in firm control of Kupiansk, despite all of these reports that we have been getting from the Ukrainians, that the Ukrainians are regaining control of Kupiansk. Well, what the Russians say, it doesn't necessarily mean that it must be true. And to repeat again, my assessments were made based on previous history and my general feeling about the situation. To repeat again a point I've made many times, I am not there. Mr. Sharov perhaps is, but I am not, and I cannot therefore corroborate and definitely say that he is telling the truth. Having said all of that, isn't it much more likely that he is indeed telling the truth than not? At least that has to be what I think. The Ukrainians have previously given us stories about successful counterattacks. The Russians have previously proved to be in places which the Ukrainians say they have recaptured. And everything we know about the flow of the battle right across the contact line strongly suggests that it is the Russians who are advancing everywhere and that it is the Ukrainians who are retreating. So, for the record, and just to finish, I do believe that what Sharov is telling us, what the Russian Defense Ministry is telling us here, is indeed true. The Russians control Kupiansk. We've had a very, very elaborate media operation. The Ukrainians do this sort of thing on a regular basis. An earlier article in TASS claimed that they were doing this in relation to Kupiansk in order to influence the Americans over the course of the discussions in Berlin. That might very well have been true. I am not saying. But anyway, the Ukrainians have this history of doing this. That leads me to conclude that the Russians almost certainly are telling the truth here, and the general state of the military operation overall also tells me that it is far more likely than not that it is the Russians here rather than the Ukrainians who are telling the truth. Now, another incident is alleged to have happened over the last 24 to 36 hours where the Russians are directly, flatly contradicting what the Ukrainians say. Now, about a couple of hours ago, the Ukrainians claimed that an underwater drone of the Ukrainian Navy penetrated the Russian base in Novorossiysk on the eastern coast of the Black Sea, well to the east of Crimea, and successfully attacked and damaged a Russian Navy submarine, a submarine of the Kilo class, one of the 6 submarines, I believe, that the Russian Black Sea Fleet has. And video footage was provided by the Ukrainians, undoubtedly taken by a Ukrainian drone, which showed the port of Novorossiysk, and one could see various warships there. And there was pictures of the submarine in question. And then the film seemed to move further away. And then we heard that there was pictures of some big explosion. And, well, the Ukrainians produced this video footage as proof that they had indeed successfully damaged and destroyed the submarine. Now, I am not the best person to watch videos. I have visual problems, and just as I have difficulty reading maps, reading videos, or looking at satellite pictures is deeply problematic for me. So what I'm going to say now, be aware of this point that I've just made about my own visual abilities. For the record, I saw footage, the drone footage of the port. I saw drone footage of the submarine, and I saw drone footage of the explosion. But I didn't see that the drone footage was of the submarine. Perhaps it was, but I don't know. Anyway, the Russians have, again, somewhat unusually denied the Ukrainian story. And again, this appears today on the Russian Defense Ministry website. Information disseminated by special services of Ukraine about the alleged destruction of one of the Russian submarines in the bay of the Black Sea Fleet's Novorossiysk naval base do not correspond to reality. The enemy attempt to carry out sabotage actions using an uncrewed surface vehicle did not achieve its results. Its goals, not a single ship or submarine, as well as the crews of the Black Sea Fleet stationed in the bay of the Novorossiysk naval base, were damaged as a result of the sabotage. The warships, in other words, served normally. So the Russians admit that there was an attack, but they say that the attack was unsuccessful. That begs the question about the explosion. Was it of the drone? Is that just a picture of the drone exploding? Did the drone actually hit something? Maybe not the submarine, maybe something else, maybe some guard position, some structure that was guarding and protecting the submarine. I'm not able to say. But anyway, that's what the Russians claim. Again, I am not there. I can't tell you what the exact truth is here. But bear in mind that the Ukrainians do have a history of making claims which have turned out to be inflated and wrong. And for the record, I place more weight on the Russian statement. So that's what I'm going to say about this. I have discussed all of this in detail. Suffice to say, the important point, the Russians deny that there is an ongoing Ukrainian offensive in Kupiansk. They insist that Kupiansk is firmly under their control, that at most small groups of Ukrainian soldiers, 2 at a time, have been trying to infiltrate the town, perhaps to unveil flags or take pictures there. But all of these operations, according to the Russians, are unsuccessful, and between 2 and 6 Ukrainian soldiers represent the entire Ukrainian presence in Kupiansk, and the Russians have them all surrounded in 2 buildings in the Yubileyny district in Kupiansk. Anyway, let's go to where really important things are now taking place. which is perhaps mostly now in Zaporizhia region. This is where the biggest advances appear to be happening. And there's been various reports, and the cumulative reports appear to be that the Russians are breaking through in Gulyapolye, and they are breaking through to the north of Gulyapolye as well, that the Ukrainian defense line is collapsing, and that Gulyapolye is indeed being successfully stormed. Now, there is apparently some video footage, and there is some corroborative commentary about all of these claims. The reports now suggest that about 40% of Gulyapolye is under Russian control, that there is fighting taking place in the central district of Gulyapolye to the west of the Gainchur River, and that the Russians have broken through to the western outskirts of Gulyapolye, both in the north of the town, which is mostly under Russian control, and to the south of the town, which is apparently almost entirely under Russian control. So these are the reports that I'm seeing, and they do seem to be reliable. The Ukrainians are just holding on, but the Russian pressure appears to be enormous and irresistible. The Russians have complete aerial dominance, and they heavily outnumber the Ukrainians in this area. And of course, they have artillery and all of those things. And so it looks as if the Russians in Gulyapolye are indeed breaking through. If these reports are true, then it is likely that sometime next week there will be a Russian breakthrough, final breakthrough in Gulyapolye, and the entire town will fall under Ukrainian control. The German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, over the last 24 hours, has floated the possibility of a Christmas truce. He has been in discussions with Zelensky about a Christmas truce. I can recall previous years when the Russians have Putin offered a Christmas truce only for the Ukrainians to reject it. It seems that on this occasion, the Ukrainians are rejecting the Christmas truce, even as Merz is proposing it, and it is the Ukrainians who want to accept it. And I suspect this critical situation in Gulyapolye is the reason. The Ukrainians know how disastrous it would be for their positions in Zaporizhia region, were they to lose the town of Gulyapolye. And for that reason, they've been asking for a truce. They've asked Merz to back the proposal. They hope that this time the Russians will agree, because that, it seems to me, is the only way they can stabilize, at least for a temporary period, the situation in Gulyapolye. Now, on the topic of a Christmas truce, a point which perhaps Merz is unaware of is that, of course, the Russians celebrate Christmas on a different calendar date from the one that the Germans do. The Germans calculate Christmas, the day of Christmas, on the basis of the Julian calendar, or rather of the Gregorian calendar, sorry. The Russian Orthodox Church sticks with the older Julian calendar, which in practical terms means that the Western Christmas, including in Germany, and I believe nowadays in Ukraine, is celebrated on the 25th of December, whereas the Russian Christmas is, of course, celebrated on the 7th of January. I suspect that by the time we get to the 7th of January, Gulyapolye will be firmly in Russian hands. Just saying. And I can't imagine that the Russians are going to be at all prepared to grant a truce to the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians can celebrate in peace the Western Christmas instead of the canonical Russian Orthodox Christmas, in light of the recent steps that the Ukrainians have been taking against the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And, well, besides, the Russians undoubtedly know what it is that the Ukrainians are trying to achieve through this truce, and probably mounts as well, stabilizing the situation primarily in Gulyapolye. Now, as I discussed in my program yesterday, this entire front line, this entire fortified line that the Ukrainians created in Zaporia region looks like it's crumbling. There are reports on the Russian side of the internet, it must be said, that the Ukrainians are now frantically trying to create defense lines, new defense lines, to the east of the city of Zaporizhia itself. Difficult to do in winter when the ground perhaps is sometimes harder. But anyway, it doesn't seem, if these reports are correct, as if the Ukrainians are very confident that the defences in Gulyapolye and perhaps before long in Orechov are going to hold for very long. Meanwhile, the Russians continue to pound Odessa by air. Apparently, they're now bombing Odessa with fab bombs. The Russians have developed longer range versions of their fab bombs, which now carry rudimentary jet engines, so that their range has been greatly increased, enabling the Sukhoi 34 fighters that launch these bombs to launch them far outside the area of control of Ukrainian air defense. But when speaking about Ukrainian air defense, I should say that from what I've been able to judge about the overall situation with Ukrainian air defenses, they are largely history now. Anyway, I have not seen myself, again, bear in mind my visual issues, but I have not yet myself seen much evidence of Ukrainian air defenses, air missile defenses, operating effectively against Russian missile and drone strikes on Kiev and on other cities. The Ukrainians themselves, of course, claim that they continue to have significant success shooting down drones, Russian drones, and missiles. But the overall story, the overall situation tells a different story. And again, I saw reports this time in the Western media that the situation with the Ukrainian energy system is now so fragile that there is a real risk now, a real threat that energy supplies from the remaining functional Ukrainian power stations, which are concentrated in the west of Ukraine, that energy supplies to eastern Ukraine, I'm not sure what that means, by the way, whether that means Ukraine east of the Dnieper River, or whether it includes cities like Zaporizhia, Kherson, Dnipro, Kremenchuk, and of course Kiev itself. But anyway, power, electrical power of Ukrainian towns in the eastern part of Ukraine could be permanently cut off. Well, as I said, I don't know exactly what is meant here. And of course, there's always the uncertainty about what Russian intentions are, whether they do intend to impose a total blackout on eastern Ukraine. But there seems to be now a general admission that the Russians can indeed achieve that and are very close to doing so, and that it is simply a question for them of intention or decision whether they do it or not. Anyway, the other thing that the Russians appear to be doing in the Odessa region is taking steps to isolate the territory of Odessa. They have been focusing very heavily on attacks on a particular bridge. That bridge, which apparently is still standing and still operating. Bridges, as I've discussed previously in much earlier programs, are actually difficult objects to destroy, particularly bridges built by the Soviet Union, which were intended to withstand bombing and such attacks. But anyway, there's been one particular bridge which the Russians have attacked repeatedly. There's video footage which apparently shows up to 15 drones, Russian drones attacking this bridge. Presumably, if the Russians were to launch heavy missiles and bombs against this bridge, they would destroy it. Perhaps that is their eventual plan. Now, it's been suggested that all of these attacks are intended to prevent movement of supplies from Odessa and from the west through Odessa to the Ukrainian forces in the east. And I'm not saying that that isn't part of the Russian intention. But it also, by the way, and I just want to say this, looks to me as if the Russians are taking the first steps to isolate Odessa and its surrounding hinterland from the rest of Ukraine, perhaps in preparation for some kind of operation against Odessa. An operation which conceivably might be conducted, at least in part, by sea. Just saying. Anyway, I'm not a military expert. I'm not here to discuss the tactics of this, but certainly Odessa and its environs are being very heavily hammered. And, well, there's also reports that the Russians continued their advance in west of Siversk. Radovka did a long piece about this yesterday, and they said interestingly that the Ukrainian brigade that had been defending Siversk has maintained unit cohesion, that it withdrew from Siversk in one piece, and that it's gradually, step by step, withdrawing across the countryside. All of which, if it's true, by the way, suggests an extremely tough brigade, extremely well commanded. It's important, I think, that one does acknowledge this, of Ukrainian units as well. And it's something which, as far as I'm concerned, has come as something of a surprise. Anyway, the point is, nonetheless, that the Russians continue to advance westwards. Firstly, towards the power station, which apparently supplies the electricity to Siversk and to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which the Russians no doubt will want to capture, though whether they will indeed use its capture to switch off electricity supplies to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk is another matter. And also, I would say that the Russians continue their step-by-step advance towards the village of Rai Alexandrovka, which also lies to the west of Slavyansk too. So the Russian advances continue. The most dramatic events, however, continue to play out in Zaporizhia and in Mirnograd. The long agony of the surrounded Ukrainian troops there continues, though I noticed again that the Russian Defense Ministry appears to feel that this is indeed coming towards its end. They talk about how Ukrainian formations in Dmitrov, which they mean Mirnograd, continue to be neutralized, and that the Russian troops continue mopping up the settlements of Svetloye and Grishino from scattered Ukrainian formations. And, well, the last comments are written in bold, which again suggests to me that the Russians are going to announce that Grishino and Svetloye have passed under Russian control fairly soon. Anyway, that's the overall military situation on the battlefronts. We reached that stage where the Russians are consolidating their gains, reorganizing their forces. They have to break through Gulyapolye. They have to end the situation with the trapped Ukrainian troops in Mirnograd and east of Kupiansk. When all of that happens, then I suspect that we're going to see another big forward surge in the Russian advance. This time, the objectives will be to surround Slavyansk from the north and east, and to capture Konstantinovka, and to press forward towards Orekhov in Zaporizhia region. These, I think, are now clearly identified as the main Russian objectives over the remainder of the winter. And assuming that the Russians achieve those objectives over the winter, they will enter the spring campaigning season, from an exceptionally strong military position. And I've no doubt that they will achieve all of these things. Which brings me back to this bizarre charade that is played out in Berlin. Because what is it exactly that all of these people who are meeting in Berlin really want to do? They want to prop up Zelensky. Why? They want the war in Ukraine to continue, because that's the logical outcome of European policy. They want the war in Ukraine to continue so that they can blame Trump when it is lost. Is that a worthy objective? Trump wants a deal. He's even spoken about this as being a kind of real estate deal, which I thought was an incredible, inappropriate use of language. Ryabkov, by the way, in his interview to ABC, said that the Russians really do not like this word deal to describe the situation in Kupiansk. They strongly object to this use of this word, and they're right to, by the way. But Trump wants a deal so that he can avoid the embarrassment of having Ukraine capitulate on his watch. Well, I can understand the politics of that, but is that an intelligible objective either? The historian Jeff Roberts has referred me to a recent article in Strana. Strana is an excellent Ukrainian news site, and I say excellent, I should stress, it is not just a Ukrainian news site, but it is a pro-Ukrainian news site. Its sympathies in this war are not with Russia. They are entirely with Ukraine, just to say. But it is also a dissident news site. It is deeply critical of Zelensky and of his government. And as a result, as I understand it, it has to now be produced and published outside Ukraine itself. Anyway, Strana, again, looking at everything from a Ukrainian point of view, says, is it really objectively for a good thing if the Europeans really were to give Ukraine a 140 billion euro loan using the Russian assets as collateral? Put aside all the illegalities, put aside what the Russians might do, put aside the question of what that might mean for the financial credibility of Europe. If you do this, you will end up with two outcomes. Firstly, you will shore up Zelensky's position in Kiev and prolong the war. A war which Ukraine is losing, and the present trajectory shows it will continue to lose. So you will just make Ukraine's long-term position even worse than it already is. That is one. Strana doesn't say it, but I will. You will also create more opportunities for corruption in what is now universally acknowledged to be a deeply corrupt operation that is taking place in Kiev at this time. But the other thing that you're going to do if you give Ukraine the 140 billion euros is that you're going to mean that the Russian assets cannot be used for any other purpose. They obviously cannot be repaid to Russia, but they cannot be used for any other purpose either, because all of them would be allocated, would be collateral for an existing loan that has already been provided to Ukraine. And Strana makes the point that say what you will about the Trump plan and about Trump's ideas about what should be done with the frozen assets, but at least his idea is that they should be used after the war to rebuild Ukraine. Instead of the assets being used for that purpose, they will be used instead to prolong the war, which Ukraine is losing and is going to lose. So, is this even in Ukraine's interests? I am very tired of all of these people who constantly say that they are acting in Ukraine's interests and who are encouraging Ukraine and making sure that Ukraine continues this war in some form. Yulia Mendel, Zelensky's former press spokesman, has spoken out strongly against this practice. She's pointed out that Ukraine is not just losing the war, but that all of this rhetoric, all of this support is going to make Ukraine lose even more badly. Zelensky's former spin doctor, Arestovich, says the same thing as Mendel, using often much cruder language. Isn't it wise that we started to listen finally to these Ukrainians, people like Mendel and Arestovich and Strana, rather than, well, to people like Zelensky, who might be implicated in a corruption scandal, and some of whose friends are implicated in a corruption scandal, and who seem instead determined to prolong the war. Anyway, there is no sign that the Europeans are in any mood to change course. We'll see where all this leads, whether there's going to be any change of tactics or strategy at any point on the part of the West. My own view, for the record, is that what we're almost certainly going to see, as soon as it becomes clear that the revised Berlin proposals are unacceptable to the Russians, we're going to see demands for more escalation. Zelensky is already calling for more weapons deliveries, and I understand that Senator Graham in the United States is again trying to strengthen the rhetoric on further sanctions against Russia. So we're more likely to see more escalation from the West over the next few months. But none of that is going to change the underlying dynamics of the war. It's going to lead to the bigger disaster, the bigger defeat in the end in Ukraine. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also, of course, now find us on Substack. Please remember, if you want to support us, that you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.